We are reading from Love Came Down at Christmas, Daily Readings for Advent by Sinclair Ferguson. And today we are in chapter 11, Easily Irritated? Love is not irritable. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 and 5. It is easy to get irritated at Christmas time with the overplayed Christmas jingles that miss its real meaning, or the impossible to untangle Christmas tree lights. Whose fault is it? Or the look how well our children are doing Christmas letters. At one level, the causes of our irritation seem obvious enough, but a deeper irritation usually goes unrecognized. Irritation with God. A minister I knew sometimes took an unusual pastoral approach with people. He would ask them to read through the parables of Jesus and tell him which ones irritated them. I think he was onto something. Preachers are often told that what really helps people is narrative, stories. That was how Jesus preached. He told parables. Maybe it is true that stories help people understand better, but that is not why Jesus told parables. In fact, he said that he told them to make clear who didn't understand them. That's Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 through 15. They might like the story, but entirely miss the point. My friend was much nearer the mark. Jesus' parables are meant to get under our skin, to reveal that our sin has created within us an irritation with God and his ways. Until we embrace Christ in the gospel, we will continue to be irritated with God and refuse to yield to him. Take the parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector in Luke chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus added, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. Of course, you knew that. But that is only because you're familiar with Jesus' punchline to the story. And if you're honest, that line no longer has any punch for you, which may mean you still don't get it. For the people who listened to Jesus, his words must have felt like a blow to the stomach. But if you think honestly about it, you'll notice something. You may, in fact, be more like the Pharisee than the tax collector. The chances are you go to church. So for a start, you are not like other men. You thank God for keeping you from sin, don't you? Plus, you have high moral standards. You try not to cheat. You treat people fairly, and you're not sexually immoral like so many other people. And you engage in religious activities. You try to give faithfully and to be disciplined. And it is a long time since you beat your breast in church, even metaphorically, and cried out for mercy. Maybe you once beat your breast, but now, well, you don't see so much need for it these days. Not now that you've been forgiven. So, are you more like the Pharisee than the tax collector? If so, here's the problem. It was the tax collector who walked out of the temple justified. God's ways in this parable can be just as irritating to us as in Jesus' parable about equal pay for laborers in a vineyard, no matter how many hours in the day they had worked. It can be very irritating to discover that the last will be first and the first last. Matthew 20, verses 1 through 16. But what is the point of this diversion into understanding the parables? Simply this: only when this fundamental irritation is brought to the surface and dealt with by God's grace will we begin to experience and express the love that is not irritable. Irritation with God and his ways was injected into the human race in the Garden of Eden. "Don't you see that God isn't really fair and loving?" said the serpent. "Did he surround you with fruit-bearing trees just to irritate you by not letting you eat of any of them?" Eve struggled a little, but her vision was already beginning to be distorted. Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. That irritation with God soon became irritation between husband and wife, and then brother and brother. Genesis chapter 3, verse 12, and chapter 4, verses 3 through 8. If we're going to be delivered from being irritable, we need to find a cure for this fundamental irritation with God about his ways. Only then will we be able to love and not be irritated. Irritability, by whatever name we call it, and whether caused by other people or our circumstances, is at root irritation with God for the way that he is providentially governing our lives. We blame our circumstances or other people or our background or even our genes, but none of this can function apart from God's sovereign will and purpose. Only when we have yielded to the sovereign will of God, knowing that he will work everything together for good, do we learn a healthy spiritual detachment from the irritations of life. It doesn't mean we're fatalistic. It does mean that we do not try to change things. It does not mean that we do not try to change things for the better, relieve pain, or remove obstacles to happiness. But now we do all those things with our hearts at rest in God, knowing that he works for the good of those who love him. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. The remedy for my irritability, therefore, will not be found in a determination to be less irritable, but only in a sense of the love of God for me and in the trust in him it produces. Jesus' life was marked by irritants from beginning to end, from birth in an outhouse to followers who proved to be fickle, enemies who plotted against him, people who disappointed him, religious leaders who planned to kill him, an empire whose representative declined to vindicate him, soldiers who vented their cynicism upon him, spectators who came to watch his crucifixion. His whole life was one long saga of irritants. Yet we hear no irritable word. Read Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7. 1 Peter 2, verses 22 through 23. We see no irritated action or reaction. What we observe is a humble bowing before his Father's will. How was that possible? Because he loved his Father, trusted his plan, and knew that his ways were perfect. When he comes to indwell us by his Spirit, that same grace in which he lived from the womb to the throne begins to be reproduced in us. There was no irritability in Jesus. In fact, it was to deal with ours that love came down at Christmas. Let's reflect upon what we've just heard. Think about some specific irritations that you feel. Can you identify the irritation with God at their root? How does what you've heard today counter that attitude? And finally, we'll close with a prayer written once again by George Matheson, who lived between 1842 and 1906. Make me a captive, Lord, and then I shall be free. Force me to render up my sword, and I shall conqueror be. I sink in life's alarms when by myself I stand. Imprison me within thine arms, and strong shall be my hand. My heart is weak and poor, until it master find. It has no spring of action sure, it varies with the wind. It cannot freely move, till thou hast wrought its chain. Enslave it with thy matchless love, and deathless it shall reign. My power is faint and low, till I have learned to serve. It lacks the needed fire to glow, it lacks the breeze to nerve. It cannot drive the world until itself be driven. Its flag can only be unfurled when thou shalt breathe from heaven. My will is not my own, till thou hast made it thine. If it would reach a monarch's throne, it must its crown resign. It only stands unbent amid the clashing strife, when on thy bosom it has lent, and found in thee its life. Merry Christmas.